What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video, we diving into another meta deck breakdown, and this is the new up-and-coming deck that you probably have seen rotating around on the meta scene, and that is Mono Green Food. If you're not sure what Mono Green Food is, essentially what the deck is trying to play, it's a variation, I think, of a Mono Green Stompy deck that was kind of around at the beginning of the standard season when Zendikar Rising came out, and as time has gone on and based on how the meta has shifted, this is kind of where mono green is currently. Overall, the primary win condition of this deck is essentially playing things, getting food out onto the battlefield, and then either doing various things, just getting very large creatures on the battlefield that your opponent can't, block very well and or absorb that much damage over time. And in that part, you kind of gain counters and destructibility. You fight creatures and things like that to kind of eliminate your opponent's side of the battlefield. And essentially there are a few cards that definitely help us along to get to that point. Definitely it is one of those decks that I think is kind of like one of those new decks. I think it's a lot more seen in the traditional sense of Magic in the best 2 or 3 games. It is, I think, making its way in the best of 1 just because it is a very solid deck. There are matchups that it's very strong against, which are those very aggro aggressive decks, just because the creatures in the deck are much larger, and they take benefit of things getting put in the graveyard, and there's benefits of our things getting put in the graveyard, so we can actually kind of get around playing counter spells and things like that. Though I will say the other thing to be part of, just because it is also mono green, there are some weaknesses that come in playing a mono green deck, and then I think the first and foremost thing compared to other aggro decks is that it's not as aggressive because most of the creatures don't have haste. The other thing too, other than the fight spells, there really isn't much in the way of removal to getting things off the battlefield. The real way we do it is we either fight creatures or we just stomp over them with this deck. So that is one of those things. There's no big Embercleave finisher in this deck. There's not really that thing, but we do have other things to hopefully get us there. We do also play, a fair share of lands in this deck just because we want to make sure we hit our land drops, because getting to that, mid game in this deck is very good for us. Like, we play the Mammoths, we play the Tangled Florahedrons and things like that, as well as we play Crawling Barrens, especially because this deck is built to kind of grind out games, especially if they go long, just because the way it's built with the way of life gaining from food, and also being able to kind of, slowly make our opponent not want to attack aggressively into our bigger creatures. And like I said, this deck has a few win conditions up its sleeve. The first and foremost, as you can kind of see in the high drop pile, is actually the Great Henge. Great Henge is a very good card in this deck, just on the sense of turn 3 Lovestruck Beast, turn 4 you probably could play Great Henge as long as Lovestruck Beast is on the battlefield. The reason why this helps us is because it's one of our ways to kind of draw into the deck and get a little bit deeper to get other things onto the battlefield. This deck is mostly creatures. There's very few spells, so when we're digging into our deck, we're going to more than likely hit creatures, and with the ability to give it +1/+1 counters, it definitely makes cards like Heartless Act definitely hard to kind of slow us down in what we're trying to do. The additional benefit of it giving us 2 lands, 2 green mana, and also 2 life is also very good. And we also have other cards that definitely help us out in this deck. The Feast and Troll King is another card that's actually fairly strong, I think, in this deck, in the sense of it's only 6 cost. It does cost 4 green mana, which I guess if you're playing Devotion is actually pretty strong in that sense. But the ability of, even if it gets put into the graveyard and our opponent has no way of really removing it from our graveyard, we can actually sacrifice 3 food tokens and actually recast it from our graveyard onto the battlefield, which definitely makes it annoying for our opponent to try to remove it completely off the battlefield. The only real way they can attack it is once they remove it from the battlefield, is to remove it from the graveyard and exile it. Also, with that being said, we also have other cards that we can give indestructibility, like the Wicked Wolf. Also, it's a fight spell, so we can sacrifice food when it comes on the battlefield if we're trying to attack into something that's a little bit bigger. Essentially what that does, it puts +1/+1 counter on Wicked Wolf, gives it indestructible, and then essentially, if we fight a creature that's either of equal, power and toughness, it's going to survive that battle. We also play 1 Kogla in this version of the deck. I also seen other people play other things, but Kogla I feel like is very good in this style of deck. The other thing I could actually see in my version I have here is I like the Thrash and Brontodon, just because I feel like the sacrifice effect is fairly strong, and it's also very solid blocker, being a 3/4. The other thing that you could probably do here, which I have in the sideboard, here are some other cards I've seen in other mono green food decks that you could also play in. But that is, you can play Gem Razor. The only problem I think with Gem Razor, I feel, is that if you can't mutate onto a creature because your opponent's doing a very good job of keeping the battlefield clean, it does make its enchantment destroyer / artifact destroyer kind of hard to actually resolve in that sense. That is the only downfall I think with playing Gem Razor, but Gem Razor is also a very good option in the sense that it has reach, it has trample, and it is also a 4/4 that you can possibly play on turn 3. With that being said, I think this deck is definitely worth building in the sense that it is a very strong competitive deck. And I think as we kind of see when Kaldheim comes out with the more recent spoilers, I think this deck could actually get stronger. Just as in a sense that from what I'm gathering, a lot of the decks that are currently, the top meta decks, I feel like will kind of stay there. I don't really see anything because, I mean, sure, we haven't really had a full list of spoilers yet. I think maybe on the day I'm recording that today is actually the day when they start spoiling. I know on the client, we now have the previews to, pre-order the 2 packs on the client, so maybe in the next 7 days maybe I'll see more that would give me different hints of other decks that could be up and coming. But I can see this deck just becoming that much better with additional cards in that sense, just because there's things that could hopefully benefit us, especially in the early game, because I do see certain things that are okay in the early game, but we can maybe get something better as the set gets spoiled. But other than that, I think there are other things and other mechanics that we have in the deck that definitely help us out. I think Trail of Crumbs is a very solid card, just because other than creating food, whenever we sacrifice food, we can pay 1 mana, and then we can look at the top 2 cards of our library, and we can choose a permanent card from them and add it to our hand. Essentially, our deck is permanent cards, so it helps. That's another way of us digging. I think Witch's Oven's another good way, in a sense that we can always sacrifice something our opponent's targeting to dissolve their spell. Also in the sense that we gain food, and if we want to sacrifice one of our larger creatures, we then gain 2 food instead of 1, which essentially helps us just play something like a Beast and Troll King. And like I said, I think Crawling Barrens is one of those cards that I was kind of seeing a resurgence, just because it is actually a very strong card, because if we don't have anything to really play, we can always play Crawling Barrens or add counters to the Crawling Barrens. And in the late game, it is definitely tough for our opponent to really remove the Crawling Barrens, especially when it starts getting much larger, because cards like Heartless Act don't really do anything to it. Overall, I think the deck is pretty straightforward on how you want to sequence your turns. I think definitely on turn 1, you want to try to hit something like a, Gilded Goose. I know Witch's Ovens also play, but without sacrificing anything, Witch's Ovens you can kind of play on turn 1. It's okay, but it's not great. Turn 2, if you get lucky enough to draw Trail of Crumbs, that is a very solid card to get started and going on the battlefield. Just because there's also not a lot of enchantment removal, it's definitely a card that can definitely stick on the battlefield. Scavenged Ooze is another solid play in that sense, in the ability that you have a 2/2, and then eventually if your opponent starts throwing things in the graveyard, you can start eating it. Though I will say it's kind of interesting, if you don't have open mana, I would say wait on playing Scavenged Ooze, just in case there is a lot of mono red and there's a lot of burn on the battlefield. Maybe there's something you can do to maybe add counters to it in response to something. Though I will also say, the one thing I forgot to mention is you can always play the Lovestruck Beast token on turn 1 as well, besides the Gilded Goose. It's just a good way to start ramping up, get that Lovestruck Beast eventually out on the battlefield, which is also a very solid play. Turn 3 can go various ways. If you played the token for the Lovestruck Beast, you can always go about playing the Lovestruck Beast on the battlefield. Mammoth is also a very solid option, though most of the time, depending on the situation, we could always use it as also face down land. And also Thrash and Brontodon, depending on the deck that you're playing. A 3/4 is a very solid blocker with the ability to sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment, depending on the deck you're playing. I think that diversity gives it definitely a very solid multi-use ability. Also, like I said, if you do decide to play Gem Razor, you can always decide to play Gem Razor over Thrash and Brontodon on turn 3. Gem Razor is also pretty solid, especially if there's something for it to target. Turn 4, I think it only really works out to be in Wicked Wolf, especially if you have food. You can start eating away at your opponent's creatures. Like I said, the fight spells are really the only way we can remove things directly with damage. Outside of that, we just have to get very big as quickly as possible against our opponent. Turn 5, 6 or so, hopefully maybe at this point you draw on the Castle Gambreak, because on turn 5, if you have 4 lands in a Castle Gambreak, you can produce 6 mana, which essentially plays the last pile in the row of the deck. Essentially, you could possibly play a Great Henge if you have creatures on the battlefield. Beast and Troll King for 6 mana is also a very solid option, just on the ability. It also creates food if you play it from your hand, and Kogla to start fighting away your opponent's creatures as well. It being a 7/6 definitely is kind of tough for our opponent to deal with, especially if we get it out earlier the better, I guess, in that sense. But overall, I mean, this is the deck. Like I said, there are other sideboard options that you could always add in. Not saying like sideboard as in like you'd build this to play multi games, but I mean, there could be reason to say add an Elder Gargoth, a Vivian, a Garrick. Actually, the one weird thing I did see is Ugin is a very interesting thing, but I guess Ugin's there to be that one big all end all. Most of the decks that I saw that played Ugin was like the one of, but I think it's just essentially just for that board wipe and removal, especially if our opponent's playing a lot of things. Maybe it's good for our matchup against like Doom Foretold style decks in that sense. But overall, I mean, this is a deck run list that you can run with. I think this one's kind of closer to the deck list you may have seen on other channels when they've actually physically played the decks. But I think I said it is a deck that will take getting some used to, getting used to like how to use the food counters in, you know, proper way. And worst case scenario, at the end of the day, you can always just sacrifice food for life, because three life is always great, especially if you are getting a little bit slow to get things going. Overall, guys, I appreciate you guys watching this video. If you like it, hit that like button. It definitely helps out. As we get into the new end screen, as you can kind of see here, there's things popping up. You can click in either one of those things, whether there's a video. I don't even know if I'm going to be on camera, but there's going to be a video recommended to you by YouTube. If you want to click that, you can watch that. There's a video. You can click the subscribe button if you like this video. And until next time, I will see you in the next Magic Gathering video.